If you've ever played Fallout 4 and thought, I swear this worked earlier, or maybe you've wondered why enemies suddenly feel a bit tankier, maybe stealth randomly stops working how you expect, or maybe your 95% VATS shot somehow misses, I promise you it's not because you forgot how to play the game overnight. Instead, Fallout 4 hides a lot of the details of its mechanics, and I'm not talking about secret lore, I'm talking about actual systems in the game. So things like how damage works, how enemies find you, and why the difficulty spikes out of nowhere. And the problem is, when the game doesn't really explain those systems to you, it makes you feel like you're probably doing something wrong, when in reality, the rules have just quietly changed behind the scenes. So in this video, I'm breaking down the Fallout 4 mechanics the game never really explains to you. So we're not talking about exploits, just how the game actually works under the hood. And a few of these can completely change how you approach combat and stealth, and at least one of them sort of explains why Fallout 4 sometimes feels like it's lying to you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get stuck in. So let's start with one of the biggest lies Fallout 4 tells you, and that's armor. Early in the game, armor feels amazing because you slap on a leather chest piece, suddenly raiders feel like they're firing harsh language instead of bullets at you, and you think, right, more armor equals more survivability. Obviously. Well, not exactly, because later in the game you add another 30 points of damage resistance, and almost absolutely nothing changes. And that's because damage resistance in Fallout 4 has diminishing returns. So for each point of armor you add, it protects you less than the one before it, if that makes sense. Armor you come across in the early game gives you big gains, but armor you come across later on gives you tiny gains. So when you're wondering why wearing what looks to be like a small tank outfit, but enemies are still deleting your health bar like it's non-existent, it's not because your armor is bad. It's because the game has quietly decided you've had enough protection now, and this is how you're going to play going forwards. This is also why enemies feel tankier at the same time, because their resistance scales as well, and you're both hitting that diminishing return wall together. And this leads nicely into the next problem. Fallout 4 doesn't scale enemies smoothly alongside you, and instead it does it in tiers. And that means that everything feels fine, and then suddenly, it really doesn't feel fine. One level, you're clearing areas comfortably, and then out of nowhere, enemies gain more health, more damage, better gear, and you're standing there thinking, did my build just stop working? No, the game just quietly promoted all of your enemies, so raiders turn into tougher variants, gunners suddenly hit like they've had military training, which actually to be fair they have, and creatures jump up entire difficulty brackets. The important thing here is your power didn't drop, the game just moved the goalposts. And when this happens at the same time as armor diminishing returns, it kind of creates that classic Fallout 4 feeling of, I'm getting weaker even though I'm objectively stronger. Which brings us to weapons, because this is where a lot of players waste time and resources. Fallout 4 loves weapon mods. It really wants you to believe that if you just upgrade enough parts, any weapon can carry you through the game forever. And that is kind of optimistic. Mods usually scale off base damage, they don't really replace it, so if you're using a low tier weapon, you're basically polishing a very nice stick. You can pour perks, materials, and a lot of time into that weapon, and it'll still probably underperform compared to a higher tier gun with half the effort. And that's why people say things like, well, my gun was amazing early game and now it's basically useless. Your gun didn't get worse, the enemies just outgrew it. And Fallout 4 never really tells you when it expects you to move on from certain weapons, so players keep upgrading something that has already hit its ceiling. And if you're thinking, okay, but I turn the difficulty down and it still feels rough, that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle for the first section of this video, and that is difficulty settings. Now, Fallout 4 difficulty doesn't really make enemies smarter, they don't flank better, they don't coordinate, and sadly, they don't learn from their mistakes. What difficulty actually changes is the maths behind the scene. So on higher difficulties, enemies deal significantly more damage to you, whilst you also deal less damage to them, which means fights kind of feel harsher, mistakes are punished harder, and everything takes longer to kill. So obviously this is why turning the difficulty up can suddenly make even basic enemies feel more dangerous. It's not because they're better at fighting, it's because the game quality decided you're not allowed to hit as hard anymore and they can hit harder back at you. And that bit probably sounds quite obvious to be honest, but in Fallout 4, higher difficulties also increase the number of legendary enemies you actually encounter. So it feels like every other fight suddenly involves an enemy mutating mid-combat and getting their health bar back. Then it's not bad luck, the game is just handing you more of them because it wants to teach you a lesson. And then there's survival mode, which is its own thing entirely. So survival isn't just very hard but worse, it adds food, water, sleep, disease, limited saving, and much higher damage taken and dealt, but the AIs still behave the same way as it always has. And that's why survival feels quite brutal, not because enemies got smarter, but because the margin for error is basically non-existent. And once you understand that difficulty in Fallout 4 is mostly about damage scaling and restrictions, a lot of those sudden difficult spikes start to make a lot more sense. Right, let's move on to stealth and detection systems. Fallout 4 gives you the impression that stealth is all about shadows and line of sight. Hide in the dark, stay out of view, and everything should be fine. Except that's not entirely how it works. The single biggest factor in stealth detection in Fallout 4 is distance. You get close enough to an enemy, they can basically detect you without even seeing you. And that is why sometimes enemies seem to sense you through walls, around corners, or in total darkness. They're not psychic, you're just too close. This is especially noticeable indoors where tight spaces mean you're constantly inside detection range without even realizing it. Once you understand that distance is doing most of the work, a lot of those "how on earth did they see me" moments suddenly make a lot more sense. Suppressors are another thing that Fallout 4 slightly misrepresents. A suppressed weapon isn't silent, it just makes noise travel less far, and that means one or two suppressed shots might go unnoticed, but if you keep firing and enemies start piecing things together, this is where stealth often breaks down during longer fights, even when you're using a silenced weapon and you're staying hidden. You're not failing at stealth, the enemies are just gradually narrowing down exactly where that suspiciously quiet gunfire is coming from. The game also doesn't clearly explain enemy alert states, caution, hidden, and danger. Once enemies move from hidden to caution, that state can stick around for a very long time, even if the enemies stop actively searching for you. And not only that, but while they're in that state, detection is significantly faster, sneak attack bonuses are harder to trigger, and mistakes are punished much more quickly. And this is why re-entering an area too soon can sometimes feel like stealth is suddenly a bit useless. The enemies never really calm down, they're just pretending they did. The game never tells you when things fully reset, which makes stealth feel a little bit inconsistent when it's actually just persistent. And when you are eventually spotted, enemies don't instantly forget about you once you move either. The Fallout 4 AI tracks your last known position, not your current one. And that's why sometimes breaking line of sight and repositioning works perfectly, and other times enemies walk straight to the exact spot you were standing 5 seconds ago. They're not locking onto you through walls, instead they're searching the last place they know you existed, and once you realise that, stealth becomes less about freezing in place and more about movement and repositioning. So let's talk about VATS percentage points, because at some point Fallout 4 has absolutely betrayed all of us with this. Like, you line up a shot, it says 95%, you press the fire button, bam, miss. Suddenly, you're staring at the screen like, I don't think you understand how numbers work, bro. And that's the thing, VATS percentages aren't a promise, and instead, they're an estimate. They don't account for absolutely everything that's happening in real time. There are multiple things going on like enemy movement, limb size, partial cover, and even certain animations can all affect whether a shot actually lands. So when a high percentage shot misses, it's not the game rolling a completely fake number to you, it's because VATS can't fully predict what's about to happen once that animation starts. That doesn't really make it feel any better, but it does explain why VATS sometimes feels less like a targeting system and more like a bit of a suggestion. Another reason why combat can feel a little bit inconsistent is armor penetration, because Fallout 4 barely tells you anything about it. Some weapons naturally perform better against armored enemies than others, even if the damage numbers look similar. Certain weapon types bypass armor more efficiently, while others lose a lot of their damage once resistance kicks in. And since the game doesn't show you any of this, players often assume a certain weapon is weak when in reality it's just bad against that specific enemy. And this is why one gun can feel incredible against raiders and absolutely useless against robots or power armored enemies. Fallout 4 knows this, it just doesn't think you need to. And finally for this section, let's talk about legendary enemies, and specifically that moment when you think you've won and then they stand back and undo all of your hard work. Legendary enemies don't regenerate health randomly, instead their regeneration triggers once their health drops past a specific threshold. If you damage them slowly, you're almost guaranteeing they'll mutate and reset the fight, but if you burst them down quickly, you can sometimes skip that entirely. And this is why legendary fights can sometimes feel a little bit inconsistent. It's not luck, it's pacing. And once you know that, legendary enemies stop feeling like an unfair difficulty spike and start feeling like enemies you just have to approach a little bit differently. Let's talk about XP scaling. Have you ever felt like Fallout 4 suddenly stopped rewarding you with levels, meaning you can unlock more perks, like you went from leveling up constantly to staring at the XP bar after hours of gameplay thinking, that's barely feckin' moved. That is not a bug. Fallout 4 increases the amount of XP you need for each level in a non-linear way, like other games do. Early levels will come at you fast, later levels slow down dramatically. The game does this intentionally to stop players from becoming way too overpowered too quickly, but again, the game never actually tells you this. So instead of thinking, okay, this game's pacing me now, most players think, why does absolutely everything feel slower? And understanding this helps explain why late game progress feels really grindy, even when you're doing absolutely everything right. So, you know when you visit a location and maybe you return to it after a few in-game hours and everything's reset? Well, Fallout 4 doesn't reset the world as quickly as you might expect. Areas you cleared don't instantly refill with enemies or loot the moment you leave, and instead they rely on internal cell reset timers. If you revisit locations too soon, enemies won't actually respawn, containers will still be empty, and the world can start feeling a little bit weirdly lifeless. And this could be why some players feel like certain areas of the map dry up over time, but it's not that the content has disappeared, it's just that it hasn't been allowed to come back yet. The game never tells you this when an area is fully reset, and that makes it feel a little bit inconsistent instead of intentional. And finally, fast travel. Fast travel doesn't just move you across the map in the blink of an eye, it also advances the game world timers. So things like vendor inventories, settlement states, the enemy spawns can all be affected by how often and, more importantly, how far you fast travel. Players who rely heavily on fast travel may unknowingly change how the world behaves, while players who move slowly through it see things reset and refresh a lot differently. It's very subtle, but over time it shapes how Fallout 4 feels, especially when combined with XP scaling and those cell reset timers I just mentioned. And again, absolutely none of this is explained, the game just expects you to notice it. When you put all of these mechanics together and you start to learn more about them, so like the combat math, the stealth detection, VATS quirks, progression pacing, etc., it becomes more clear that Fallout 4 isn't inconsistent, it's just very quiet about how it works under the hood. And if the game has ever made you feel like you were playing badly or that the game was being unfair, chances are you weren't actually wrong. It's just the game never really told you what it was doing. And once you understand how these mechanics actually work under the hood, a lot of those frustrating moments suddenly make a lot more sense and the game feels a lot more consistent. Now, let me know in the comments which mechanics surprised you the most, or which one finally explains something that's kind of been annoying you for quite a while. And if you want to take this a step further, I've got another video coming up on my channel on hidden systems that actually make Fallout 4 easier. Once you know how those work, the game is significantly easier, as I just said. So, if you're still here, it would be totally awesome if you could support my channel by hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to catch you in that next one.